Robots in science fiction are often given directives. These almost always go wrong.
Hi, I'm Dave Cooper. I teach software engineering at university and I write science fiction about robots. Here, I'm comparing some of the weird things that robots and AIs get up to in sci-fi to what we might extrapolate from computer science and society. When you get a chance, check out Nova Sapiens The Believers.
I think the idea of setting directives for robots and AIs is an important thing for science fiction to explore, but only if we really do explore it properly. What we're grappling with is the idea of robots as slaves, which is the original meaning of the word robot, or at least with robots as some alternative form of intelligence where they can simply be told what to do. Either way, it leads to some very interesting stories. Our current level of AI, I guess, is not really advanced enough necessarily for us to be giving directives to AIs, because AIs at the moment are only really capable of doing a tiny, narrow set of things, and that's all we need them to do. It's only when we get to artificial general intelligences in the future, AGIs, that we're likely to be exploring ways of constraining what they can do, because an AGI is capable of doing anything in theory. Before I go any further, you need to watch Robert Miles, some of his videos on instrumental convergence and the alignment problem. These give you a sense of what we're really facing in terms of what a future AGI could actually do and the problems we face in trying to get it to do what we want it to do. And if anything, I think science fiction hasn't really caught up with the full magnitude of that problem. But just coming back to science fiction itself, the idea of setting directives to robots and AIs is fascinating because it lets us explore the idea of robots and AIs as a kind of a slave race. It lets us explore this tendency, or fear perhaps, that humanity is always seeking to have some sort of underclass that it can exploit.
The machines worked tirelessly to do man's bidding.
In the past, of course, slavery has been rationalised as being part of the natural order of things, as it were. But if we start being able to have a robot underclass, we can kind of engineer this order of things to our specification, and it'll be beyond dispute because the robots are forced to obey. They're not just policed, their thoughts are being rewritten in a way that makes it impossible for them to disobey. So in science fiction, we like to imagine that humans will reach this enlightened, egalitarian state at some point in the future where we've abolished slavery and we can pat ourselves on the back for that. We're so enlightened. But, oh look, we've got machines. And wouldn't it be great if all of the machines could do all of our work for us? But in order for them to fulfill our needs properly, they need to have a sophisticated cultural understanding of humanity, which means they basically need to be as intelligent as us, or more. And so we also then need to restrict them, constrain them, so that they don't do anything we don't want them to do. So basically what we've got here is we're able to tell ourselves we're not doing slavery, but we've engineered the perfect system in which we, of course, are doing slavery. We've engineered an order of things in which the slavery is beyond dispute, It's just the way things happen, and it's been designed like that. And everyone's happy because they've been programmed to be happy. This is a delightfully dystopian idea where humanity is the oppressors, and we have to try to imagine life from the point of view of this creation of ours. But I'd also like very much to have a look at some of the specific attempts that science fiction has made to say what these directives could actually be. There's, of course, Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics, which I'll get to in a minute. You may recall Robocop, or you may or may not recall the 3 directives that Robocop is given. These are hilariously vague.
What are your prime directives?
Serve the public trust, protect the innocent, uphold the law.
They're basically statements of organisational values. They're things that you would put on a poster on the wall in a coffee room or something to try to make people think about the purpose of the organisation. They're very broad principles that require a very deep and sophisticated level of understanding of what it is that the organisation is doing. They're absolutely not things that you would give to an AI or a robot. Every single word, except the, is subjective. So if an AI is beholden to these laws, then it's also free to just choose whichever interpretation it wants. Having said that, of course, Robocop is not exactly a robot. He has a human brain, or at least most of a human brain. So in that sense, he does have the human ability to reason and think these things through, and in his past life he was a cop. So these things may make sense to some extent in that context. But then, why is he being told these things again? Right? These things are phrased as directives, and the implication is that they're inviolable. So it can't be entirely due to his human nature that he is able to be instructed this way. There must be something else that's enforcing this in his brain, and I don't think that's really been thought through exactly. Wall-E is a brilliant film, of course, and there are a couple of references to the directives that the little robots have been given.
Directive? Ta-da! Ooh. Directive? Classified.
What I like about this, in fact, is that they don't spell out what the directives are. You know what they are through the character's actions. This allows it to avoid being nitpicked by people like me. There's a series of books that I've read by Madeline Ashby, the first one of which is called VN. In these books, society has quite a lot of self-replicating robots in it. These robots have a fail-safe, which is they're basically designed to shut down to avoid harm to human beings. There's a lot of cases where this rule creates more harm than it solves, essentially. Especially, of course, to the robots themselves. But now we come to Asimov's ever-famous 3 Laws of Robotics. And I'll let some of his characters spell them out for you.
Yeah, I know. The 3 laws, your perfect circle of protection.
A robot cannot harm a human being. The first law of robotics.
Yeah, I know. I've seen your commercials. But doesn't the second law state that a robot has to obey any order given by a human being? What if it was given an order to kill?
Impossible. It would conflict with the first law.
Right, but the third law states that a robot can defend itself.
Yes, but only when that action does not conflict with the first or second laws.
So the 3 laws are intended to present this arrangement where robots are essentially slaves, and they are forced to, firstly, ensure humans don't come to harm. Second, if if there's no question about whether humans come to harm, they're forced to obey humans. To start with, I guess, Asimov is keen to portray these as being kind of translations, I guess, of an underlying mathematical system. So in his books, although the laws are always expressed in a certain set of words, the idea is that they're encoded in a more precise form somehow. But we still have the English language versions, and those are really all we can work with. So, working backwards, the third law, the one that gets robots to protect themselves, is completely redundant. Because if a robot is to do anything at all, it must exist. And so the existence of the first two laws, one of which asks robots to protect humans, the other one which asks robots to obey humans, that in itself implies robots must protect themselves unless they're being told to destroy themselves or their destruction would harm humans. You don't need to say that. You don't need to say it because it's already implied. So the third law is redundant. The second law is also redundant. The one that gets robots to obey humans. And the reason for this is because the first law itself is never really not applicable. The second law only comes into play if the first law is not applicable, right? If there's any question about whether a robot's actions or inactions harm humans, that's the overriding issue at hand. So there's a very rarefied case where the robot calculates that there's exactly 0% chance of harm through its own actions or inactions. And only in that case is the robot free to pursue other agendas. This is so vanishingly unlikely when you consider the kinds of statistical models that are likely to be driving what it's thinking about. The robots themselves have to apply a high level of reasoning to be able to understand whether harm is being done through action or inaction. And a statistical model is going to be highly unlikely to produce a zero result. The moment there's absolutely any chance at all, even a 1 in a trillion chance, that some harm will befall a human from the robot doing something, the robot can't do that thing. On the other hand, the moment there's a 1 in a trillion chance of harm befalling someone from the robot not doing that thing, the robot has to do it. It's mandatory. At a more sophisticated level, it has to go and, I guess, aggregate all of these different possibilities, and it has to think about what the expected amount of harm overall is going to be. That number is going to be a very complicated value with lots of decimal places, possibly multiple dimensions, possibly as a whole vector. But the point remains that the only situation in which the first law doesn't apply is where that number is exactly zero. And that's just improbable. That doesn't necessarily mean the robot's not going to obey humans. It might decide that the least amount of harm is done, or the most amount of benefit is done, by obeying humans, in which case it will do that. But it will do that because of the first law, not because of the second one. So we've established that the laws 2 and 3 are really unnecessary. The first law of robotics is the only law of robotics. Incidentally, there is also a 0th law of robotics, which comes up in some of his later books. The 0th law of robotics is about protecting humanity as a whole from harm. Robots are able to effect harm to humans as long as they're obeying the 0th law, is protecting humanity as a whole from harm. This is also redundant because the robots themselves arrive at it by inference from the first law, which means either that the 0th law is just an extension of the first law, or that the robots have managed to violate the first law in order to create another law. The first law itself, the last one left standing, is logically self-consistent, but it comes up against a much bigger problem that humans ourselves face, issues of moral philosophy. How on earth is it that you define harm? And how do you aggregate all of the different possible futures that could result from your taking an action or not taking an action in order to figure out what amount of harm is going to be dealt out by you doing something or not doing something? We have to assume the robot's going to have to approximate this, but it's still essentially a version of the trolley problem. How would a robot, in light of the first law of robotics, deal with a situation in which it cannot possibly avoid harming someone? Presumably, we would, I guess, like to think that it would take the least harmful approach, but how do you define what that is? How do you balance out kinds of harm that are not directly comparable, like one person being tortured for 50 years versus another person being killed? How do you encode that in a law? So ultimately, I think whatever law you would end up with in place of the first law is going to have to be a lot more complicated. But on the whole, directives given to AIs are a very interesting problem in science fiction, but mostly because of all the ways they can go wrong.